Hey everybody, Quantum here, and in this video we're going to be covering my Sapphire Steel deck. This is an end of June / start of July build, so potentially something that you could be playing for store set championships. And I do think that this is one of the strongest decks in the format when you know how to play it correctly, so don't play this unless you have a lot of play testing in. Just before we get started though, I just want to mention that these deck profiles do come out early for YouTube members, so if you want to subscribe to that, it's like $2.99 a month. You can do that. The link is in the description, like we pinned in the comments. And you don't have to, right? This content will be made public to everybody like 24 to 48 hours afterwards, but it's just something to reward the people who like to do a little bit extra to support the channel. But you can also support by liking, commenting, and of course, subscribing. All right, so let's go ahead and jump straight in. Gameplay of me using this deck both in real life and on Pixelborn is on my channel. Likely linked in the description is the games of my real life play with this deck. So in my opinion, Sapphire Steel had a huge problem solved with the addition of these Fortisphere. So of course we're playing 4 Popsicle and 4 Fortisphere. Fortisphere does a couple of things with this deck. I briefly explained this in one of my gameplay videos, but instead of playing Develop Your Brain now in the 1-drop slot, you have a sticky item, right? You play this, it stays on the board. And having 8 of these items that replace themselves is very good. So it gives you a lot of card draw, and it also acts as an item for Hiram, and it also allows you to now outpace the Ruby Sapphire deck, which is one of the matchups that gave Sapphire Steel a lot of trouble in set 3. And you're able to outpace it because you can flood the board with more relevant items that you can keep on board in order for your Tamatoa to get the dime effect off more effectively. So in certain scenarios, you can definitely not have to worry about my opponents building up a large board on the Ruby side. Do I have to worry about outing their threats when I don't really have too much top end to do that? It's like, no, I can really just race them. Can I see my dime faster than they can? Can I pop it off a few times and win the game before they're able to clutch it out, because they essentially have the same game plan. But this combination does a lot for the deck. Also, the fact that it replaces itself helps you against discard and things like that. Because as we know, right, even against discard, if you have no hand, as long as you've ramped up enough and you have a couple of items on board, your top decks could be really, really strong, especially if you already have a diamond play, right? Because you're just diming whatever you top deck in terms of a character. In the 2-drop slot, I experimented with less and even with none, but I do think 4 Mr. Smee is correct. This does a couple of things for the deck. I do think that the Flynn Rider Frenemy may phase out of the format a little bit, but this is a good counter to it when they drop it on turn 2. This is a 2-quester. Obviously, it synergizes with Cogsworth still, and it's just good pressure on turn 2, right? A 3/3 body, if your opponent is, for example, on a ramp, on another Sapphire Mirror, being able to quest with this a few times to get in a couple of early lore is really relevant. It trades into a lot of early game bodies against like other aggro decks, for example. I think Force Me is pretty good. In the late game even, it's not that bad of a top deck just to throw this down and your opponent has to answer it because it quests for 2. So really strong card still. I do think 4 is correct. And then something that you may not have played in the previous set, Into the Inklands, but I think definitely has a place in the deck now, is 1 Jump Ahead. So in set 3, you may have opted to play the Mickey Mouse, the detective, the one that when you play it, it ramps you a card, and that seems good because it's a character, it's a 3 cost, so if you don't see Fishbone, you hopefully see that, and at least you're able to ramp. But what this allows you to do is, if you're able to see one of your 8 items on turn 1, which is very likely now. So again, you can see how much Fortisphere added to the deck in terms of crafting the deck around the 1-drop item, right? Seeing this on turn 1 jumping on turn 2 allows you to play a Hiram on turn 3, right? And the odds that you get this combo off is more consistent than the Ruby Sapphire version because they don't have the extra Fortispheres. They don't have the extra draw, the extra item. Yes, they play ice blocks, but they're not getting a draw from that, right? So you have a very good chance to see, a very, effective 1, 2, and 3 curve, essentially, if you're able to drop that Hiram or Grammatala on turn 3. So the 1 jump's really good. Yes, these do get ripped out of your hand from an Ursula Deceiver, especially if you're on the draw and not on the play, but it's usually not going to be too detrimental, and I do think it's worth playing. In the late game, you just ink this off of the Fishbone, right? I was doing that a lot in my games because you don't necessarily want to be losing good top decks to this in the late game, but in the early game, seeing this early can be really, really beneficial. I've opted for 2 Babooms as well, just again, more counter aggro play, mainly for Diablos though. I know some people are on 1, some people are on 3, some people are on 0. I like 2. It also hits locations, which has come up actually. Being able to throw things into locations like a Queen's Castle and then Baboom it to finish it off has been very helpful at times. So keep that in mind. And at worst, it's just ink if anything else, right? In Sapphire Mirrors, I usually ink this, for example. You saw that if you watched my live gameplay against my friend playing Sapphire Ruby. No brainer, Fishbone Quill. A card that you definitely want to see. Unlike with Ruby Sapphire, they may not need to see this. They want to see it, but they may not need to see this. You definitely, I would say, need to see this. Yes, the one jumps are helpful to do that turn skip for turn 3 to play on turn 4. But if you don't have the one jump, you definitely want to have this. And so having, again, one of these 8 in your opening hand, depending on the matchup, right? Maybe on the draw against Emerald, you don't want the one jumps, can be very beneficial. But because this is the whole new world version, and I'll describe that when we get over to the 5 cost curve here, you definitely want to be aggressively ramping as much as possible. How you win games with this deck is you just ramp. You just ramp. That's like, it's, I don't want to say it's brain dead, because it's definitely not. It's one of the most complicated decks to play, but you just need to ramp as much as possible. Because again, if you watch some of my gameplay videos, you need to be able to play multiple interactions in a turn in order to win the game, right? And the lore count doesn't really matter too much, because you can go for like 15 lore in one turn potentially, depending on the matchup. So yeah, there's a lot to test, but I think this deck is the most well-rounded. A tech option of mine on the 3 cost curve is 2 Smash. So once again, Ursula Deceiver Evolve and Diablos mainly, but also a lot of other X and 3 bodies that might be relevant here. I just like having 2 Smash. Yes, it is a tempo loss because it's not a song, but that means it doesn't get ripped by Ursula Deceiver. And it could come in clutch, right? You know, Ruby plays Brawl, which is 2 strength or less. This is essentially Steel's version of Brawl that came out in the first chapter, right? Deal 3 damage to something and take it out. Could really be beneficial in a lot of scenarios. And again, at worst, it's just ink if you do draw it. Even in the late game, you know, being able to finish off something with this is very helpful also. On the 4 drop cost curve, no brainer in the Huron. This is one of your main draw engines. You definitely want to see this at some point, and you will likely see it, because between this, the only other draw engine we play is A Whole New World, in addition to, you know, your 8 items, which help you thin out your deck even further, which is, again, you can see how much Fortisphere does for the deck here. This one card is the only card you play from set 4 in Sapphire Steel now, but it's changed the dynamic of the deck and the meta so much. But yeah, Huron, just phenomenal. One of the best cards in the game for sure. If this goes unanswered, like, the amount of advantage you generate off of this thing is game winning. So one of the reasons to play Sapphire is Huron. I've only opted for 3 Grammatala. Cut the 4th one just to make space for other things, kind of like the Smash, the Babooms, that kind of stuff. This card is less critical. If you don't have a Fishbone, a 1-jump, a Huron, like, yeah, obviously you're playing this and hoping to find one of those. But with Lorcana's Mulligan system, you're very much favored to see one of those cards. So I don't think you necessarily need to play it. Most of the time, this is going to be ink. But if you do run into the scenario where you need to scry, you can play this. Also, it's a 3/3 body, which can come up in some scenarios. It only quests for 1, so not too relevant, but still very, very good to play. In the 4 drop slot, one of your big game closers is actually the Bell. Even into the Ruby matchups, you really only want to play this after you have the Dime on board, because then you play this, you Dime it for 5, and then it likely gets outed by a Medusa, a Brawl, a Maleficent Dragon, a Sisu, Empowered Siblings, you know, because there's a lot of things that take this out now. But if this does survive and you quest with it and then Dime it again, like, that's just obviously game, that's 15 lore. But this card is just like, you know, play it after you have Dime. You don't, sometimes you will play this early, actually, if you want to aggressively ink your hand faster, if you have inkables to ink. So in a certain scenario where you have like A Whole New World and you have like 3 cards in hand, you might like play Bell, use the effect to ink again, Fishbone, ink from your hand, then you're just like dropping your hand very fast in order to like get the advantage of extra ink while also having the Bell on board. What's also nice is, you know, the 4 toughness against other steel matchups does make this card pretty decent, especially if you have a Cogsworth on board. It's pretty hard to out for other steel decks. So there is that to keep in mind. It's kind of like you have cards that are anti-Ruby now in this deck, and you also have cards that are, I guess, anti-steel. Oh, well, I mean, Cogsworth is anti-steel in and of itself. I also play 4, and then along came Zeus. 3 along came Zeus at the 4 cost curve, that is. I just don't like going too high on the uninkable count. So that's why I opted to play like Smash, because more often than not, I'm using this on characters. There are a decent number of characters that you probably want to finish off with this, but I don't want to have multiples of these in my hand. I don't want to draw into it too early, so that's why I'm on 3 and not 4. I do know that, you know, like Savage, I think, plays 4, and he's very successful with that. So again, just test out what ratio you like. I like the 3 because I fear more the aggro decks than I do some of the top-end decks. 2 Beast, Hard-Headed. This card, I would say, is a very good tech option to play in this deck, for the simple reason that, again, if you watch my Sapphire Ruby matchups, being able to Beast Hard-Headed their Dime or just any other item in any other matchup is like can be a huge tempo swing. Because similar to what Benja does, right? When you think about like what Benja did against like Ruby Amethyst when spellbooks were in the deck, if you played a spellbook and then your opponent Benja'd the spellbook, that's your turn 3 wasted, right? Like whenever you played the spellbook, like you played a whole turn playing a spellbook, you played 3 ink for that spellbook, and I just Beast, Tragic Hero, or Benja'd it away, and I have a 2 questing body on board, and you have nothing, right? And you wasted your turn to play that item. Similar situation if they play Dime, yes, they can take it back with the Tamatoa, but doing a tempo swing by like you paid 7 to play that Dime, I'm going to out it. You're going to have to play the Tamatoa, recur that Dime, play the Dime. That's 8 for Tamatoa, 7 to replay the Dime, right? That just puts them a little bit further behind. And this is one of the cards that can swing the tempo in order for you to win the game, especially when you're on the draw. Of course, it's good into other matchups as well. And when it's not, you just ink it. But it is a 2 questing 4/4 body. And this stat line of 4/4 is more relevant now than ever. So this card, I think, is definitely a good meta tech option right now. Of course, you continue to play the 4 Cogsworth. This card is just an auto win against Steel. I shouldn't say auto win, but it's a very, very strong card into other Steel matchups. One of the key reasons why you can really get ahead of Steel's Song, right? They just can't deal with your board once you establish 1 or 2 of these or any other Steel deck, to be honest. It is pretty bad into the Ruby matchups, though, because, again, Sisu Empowered Sibling wipes it out, even though it has Ward, because that doesn't target or choose it. It just wipes out anything with 2 or less strength. They can't Brawl it or anything like that, or Ice Block it down, but, you know, Be Prepared, things like that will wipe this out. So, into Ruby, it's a little less powerful, but still not the worst. To deal with some of the top-end Steel threats and Ruby threats that you might encounter, or I should say Sapphire threats, because you don't really have an answer to Tamatoa, we got 2 Let It Goes. And this card most of the time is going to be ink, but hopefully you don't see this until the late game when you want to see it. Being able to let it go like a Cinderella Stout-Hearted, or Tinkerbell, or a Tamatoa, you know, can be a game-winning play at times, because at that moment you probably don't care what ink your opponent is on, because you're going to clutch out the game in a few turns, or the turn in like 1 or 2 turns anyways, and you just need to slow them down enough that they can't quest or out your board, right? So this card is there for that. And again, at worst it's just ink. So you can see a lot of like random tech options that, again, at worst they're just ink. Even these uninkables like the Zeus and the Grab Your Swords, which I play 2 of here, can be inked with Fishbone Quill, but you have to play these, unfortunately, because of the aggro decks, because of the Emerald decks. I was on 4 in my non-Whole New World build, but because in this build I put in 2 Babooms and 2 Smashes, I've opted to cut this down to 2, because I don't necessarily always need to see this. In certain scenarios it is very strong to see, but between Baboom and Smash, they can deal with the Diablos, basically, and the Grab Your Swords is mainly there to deal with like Prince John, Bucky, things like that against other aggressive discard decks. Plus, this being a song and Baboom and Smash not being a song give you a little bit of that counterplay against Ursula Deceiver. So I've cut this down to 2 in the non-Whole New Worlds build, and it's been working out pretty decently for me when I was testing when online was a thing, or when the online client was a thing, but also in person it's worked out fairly well. I only have 1 copy of A Foil Whole New World, and I didn't put it in this deck. Maybe I should try to look at getting 3 more, because unless this card gets banned, this card continues to be an insanely broken card. I've talked about this many times before, the application of how this card can be a tempo swing. This has been around since set 1, right? The Fishbone Quill Whole New World combination. It just gets more and more powerful as we see more and more ramping cards come out for Sapphire, basically, because the faster you're able to ramp up and then refill your hand, it's just pure advantage, right? Steel Song kind of does the same thing, except instead of ramping, they're singing songs, you know, losing card advantage in order to out your board. They have a board state, then they Whole New World, refresh their hand, and the end result is we each have 7 cards in hand. I have a board, you don't. In Sapphire Steel, it's like I have 10 ink, you have 5, we each have 7 cards in hand, our boards are probably equal, and I have the advantage because I can play multiple interactions in a turn, and my top end is very strong on the Sapphire Steel side. So 4 Whole New Worlds still. Against Ruby Sapphire, this also represents a win condition, because if you don't get clunked up, why like seeing 2 of these at a certain point, you have to ink 1, or hopefully not, but like 3 of them in a hand at the same time. But wheeling into wheel is a way that you can deck them out, especially if they're like aggressively being able to play their Hirams. So that is something to consider as well. And then again, something else that I think you probably have to play just for some of the aggro matchups, like this Tinkerbell is still an auto win against a lot of random decks, I should say. It's hard to out. A 4/5 stat line is very good. It's a quest for 2, right? The ability to take out something, deal 2 damage to something else is still very relevant. The interplayability of dealing 1 to everything is still very relevant, right? A card that instantly outs Bucky, for example, when it's not on the hidden cove, or even if it is on the cove, you know, you deal 1 damage, you aim to take out the cove, and then the 1 damage staying on it ends up taking out the character once the cove is gone, for example. So still very relevant. Yeah, missing a foil, unfortunately, only have 3, but yeah, I never really got playsets of the Chapter 1 foils for some reason. My foil Ariel is coming in the mail, though, so unfortunately I have to show you the non-foil one for this. But this is the only other card from set 4 that we're playing in this deck. This is one of your most important cards against Ruby, but it is uninkable, because you usually can play this pretty safely, even if you don't have the dime on board. So you can like play this and then play the dime the following turn, because the only thing that really outs this is going to be a Be Prepared. They can't ice block it down, Sisu wipe it, you know, because it has 3 strength. They can't Medusa it, they can't brawl it, you know, well, again, ice block, brawl it. So this card likely comes down to, because you have the extra items, you likely will have more items than your opponent, which means this can quest for 5. If you have the dime on board and then you drop this, you dime this for 5, and then it goes on, it doesn't get Be Prepared basically the next turn, then you quest for 5, dime it again for 5, like you're probably winning the game. Like when this hits the board, your opponent has to answer it because it represents such a big threat. The non-whole new world versions of this deck I think can play more of this, like 2 or 3 copies, probably 3, because again you're trading off on inkables, and this card is insanely strong in this deck with the lucky dime, because between this, Tamatoa, and Bell, you may not even want to play Bell in the non-whole new world version, but this card is definitely better, but because it's uninkable, it does hurt this deck a little bit, and you don't want to go too high on the uninkable count. So, and then to round out the deck, of course, the double lucky dime and the 4 Tamatoas. Unfortunately, one of my lucky dimes is non-foil. Not sure if I can pick up another foil one. It's like impossible to find apparently, but one day maybe. But yeah, the 4 Tamatoas is basically your closer. Insanely strong, right? You drop this, you recur items, and again, having that Fortisphere represents so much more value than in the Ruby Sapphire deck, because yes, they'll likely have a popsicle, but if they don't, like they don't want to be recurring ice blocks, right? Like recurrent ice block, play it so that they can quest with Hiram and banish the ice block if they even have their Hiram, versus you being able to bring back Fortisphere or popsicle. If you don't have popsicles, you have Fortispheres, right? Draw. Insanely strong, right? The Tamatoa representing bring back an item and then draw. That's a very insane interaction. Like if you guys have ever played TCGs, you know how important card draw is, and anything that increases consistency makes your deck better. So that one addition of Fortisphere just propelled this deck, and the Aerial, to be fair, to new heights in my opinion. But hopefully you don't see your dimes early where you have to ink them, or you know, scry them, put to the bottom of your deck with like a Grammatala, because you definitely need to see 1, and if you see 2, it's just pretty much game over. But that is going to be the deck profile for Sapphire Steel. Let me know what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree with any of the choices? There is a non-whole new world version, like I said. I think Skies is the pilot of that one. Man, I keep mispronouncing his name. Alphos posted a recent interview with him, so you know, check that out if you're interested in the non-whole new world version. Those guys are obviously very intelligent and worth a watch for sure. But as we're coming up to 20 minutes, let's go ahead and wrap up this video. If you did enjoy it, again, a like and comment would be appreciated. Thank you again for watching, though. Quantum is out.